All right, well, I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. This is a panel, a journal editors roundtable that I'm going to moderate. But before I do that, I want to thank the Institute for Social Sciences for giving us the resources to put this on. And in particular, I want to thank a couple of people, Vicki Austin, who you see walk around with the microphone. Without her, there's no chance on earth that if you left it up to Samin and I and Eric to do this, forget about it. You guys would be wandering around trying to figure out where to go. So give a round of applause for Vicki. And I'd also like to thank the staff members for the Institute, including Lauren and Monica, who probably aren't in here, but they're the ones that are doing the check-in and making sure that you get these really cool badges and all that sort of stuff. So a round of applause for them in absentia. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground so far, and I think it's been really productive. We've established significant issues with things like publication bias, significant issues with model dependency, significant issues with the potential for p-hacking, and even to some extent the potential for fraud. We've discussed best practices in the last panel on transparency, data availability, data management, and things like that. And so in some sense, I think there's a lot of reasons for optimism when it comes to issues of transparency and reproducibility. And of course, all that optimism can be quickly dashed once we submit our journal to one of these journals and we get a reject pretty quickly. So what we want to do in this roundtable here is go to the end state here. And so, of course, our careers are largely dependent, if not totally dependent on publication. And the purpose of this panel here is to discuss the issues of transparency and reproducibility from the perspective of several journal editors. I also know that there's several editors and former editors in the audience, and so I would encourage them to chime in when necessary. As I said, it's going to be a moderated roundtable, so I'm going to introduce our panelists here and then let them discuss for a few minutes their policies and their journals and how they've interfaced with these issues. I have a few set questions, and then we really want to get audience, participation, on this panel. So let me start the introductions here, and I'm just going to go in alphabetical order. I'm starting with Bill Jacoby. William Jacoby is professor of political science at Michigan State University and editor of the American Journal of Political Science. He is former director of the Inter-University Consortium for Politics and Social Research, that is ICPSR summer program in quantitative methods, and is a former editor of Journal of Politics. Professor Jacoby received his PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and before coming to Michigan State, he was on the faculty at the University of Missouri-Columbia, the Ohio State University, and the University of South Carolina. Professor Jacoby's areas of professional interest include mass political behavior, currently focusing on the effects of values on public opinion and vote choice, and quantitative methodology, especially scaling methods, measurement theory, and statistical graphics. Next is Chris Kantak, who didn't email me her bio in time for me to print it off, so I got to read it from my phone. Thanks, Chris, for this moment of awkwardness. I told her I'd make up something if she didn't send me something. Okay, so let's see what she sent me here. Okay, Chris Kantak is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh. She is co-editor with Chris Bono of State Politics and Policy Quarterly and former Associate Editor of Journal of Experimental Political Science. Her research centers on questions of representation, elite behavior, and diversity. Her book, The Diversity Paradox, Political Parties, Legislatures, and the Organizational Foundations of Representation in America, co-authored with George Krauss, was published by Oxford University Press in 2012. Early in her career, she survived several years as a colleague of Bradford Jones. Wait, I'm not supposed to read this part. She really wrote this. I guess I'm committed to reading it now. At the University of Arizona, where they met for coffee nearly every morning to talk research and mock unwitting passersby.
True story.
We were quite transparent about it, though. Okay, next is John Patty. John Patty is professor of political science at University of Chicago. John is currently co-editor of the Journal of Theoretical Politics and a member of the editorial boards of Political Analysis, Journal of Politics, Political Science Research and Methods, and former associate editor of American Journal of Political Science. He is currently a member of the search committee for a new editor of Perspectives on Politics and has previously served on the Political Science Advisory Panel for the National Science Foundation. John received his PhD in social sciences from the California Institute of Technology and did his undergrad work at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research revolves around mathematical models of political institutions with a specific focus on bureaucratic and executive politics in the United States federal government. Lastly, the only non-political scientist on the panel here is Samin Vazire. Samin is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at UC Davis. She is the editor-in-chief of the journal Social Psychology and Personality Science and senior editor at the UC Press open access journal Collabra. She has served as an associate editor for 4 other journals. She's a founding member of the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, a group that brings together scholars working to improve methods and practices in psychological science. So thank you guys for being here. So what I want to do now is just turn it over to the panelists, starting with Bill Jacoby, to talk about his journal and his experience in the context of journal editor and how the journal has dealt with this sort of changing landscape when it comes to the issue of reproducibility and transparency. So I'll start with you, Bill.
Great, thanks, Brad. To start off, while I am currently editor of the American Journal of Political Science, I drank the Kool-Aid of data transparency and reproducibility through my years at the ICPSR as director of the summer program. And in fact, when I was formerly editor of the Journal of Politics from 2001 to 2004, I tried to implement a replication policy there as well. We talked earlier today about the collective action problem involved in scholars making their data available, and it was a perfect example of it because during the 4 years I was there, no one provided any data for us. So at the American Journal of Political Science, the journal has always, as long as I can remember, encouraged authors to make replication materials available and make their data available to any interested researchers. It was encouraged, but compliance with this request was voluntary, so the degree to which authors actually did that was enormously variable from one to the next, and I must admit that I was one of the offenders at perhaps not making my data immediately available to my colleagues back in the 1980s at this point. So my immediate predecessor at the American Journal of Political Science, editor at the HAPS, Rick Wilson at Rice University, implemented a new policy in which he required authors of accepted publications to make replication files available on the AJPS Dataverse on the Harvard Dataverse network. That's all the policy specified. You had to make them available. He would not publish the article until the files were there, but as far as I know, nobody checked the files for content, and nobody specified what exactly was required. So once again, there was enormous variability in what authors provided and didn't provide. I took over the HAPS at the start of 2014, and almost exactly 13 months ago, we announced our current replication policy. It was March 26th, 2015. We implemented 2 important changes over what was there before. We still require authors to make replication files available on the Dataverse, but now we tell them what we want. On March 26th of last year, we publicized or made it publicly available for the first time a set of replication guidelines which specify the minimum amount of information and type of information that an author is required to provide in order for us to publish an article. So we ask for such things as a README file, which nobody provided before, explaining what other files are available. We want commented code in order to conduct analyses. We want the analysis data set or data sets that enable us to replicate or to reproduce all of the analyses reported in the HAPS article. And to the greatest extent possible, what we want is information that would enable a researcher to go back to the original source of the data and reconstruct the analysis data set. So the path that was followed to create the information there. So nobody had asked for this, or nobody had provided this kind of information before, so for the first time we're actually telling people what we want them to provide. At the same time, the second innovation that we put into place 13 months ago was that now once authors provide replication materials, we verify them. The AJPS and the Midwest Political Science Association have entered into an arrangement with the Howard W. Odum Institute for Research in Social Science at the University of North Carolina, such that when replication files are provided, we pass them along to the archive staff at the Odum Institute, and they reproduce or attempt to reproduce all of the analyses within each article. So we do not want to be caught in the situation where something is reported in the AJPS and nobody else can reproduce it. As I said, this policy has been in place for 13 months. We believe it's worked pretty well so far. The AJPS Dataverse, as of this morning, had 228 data sets in it, and each data set is a set of replication files. Of those, I have, back up just a little bit. Since we implemented the policy, I have accepted for publication 78 manuscripts. I'm sorry, 76 manuscripts. Of those 76 manuscripts, 8 of them did not use empirical data. They were either normative political theory pieces, or they were strictly formal models in formal theory, in which case no empirical data were there. This leaves 68 manuscripts that the Odum Institute has dealt with or is dealing with. Of those 68, 54 of them have passed through successfully, meaning that all of the analyses have been reproduced. We have 14 in process right now, and of those 14, 8 of them are, 8 of them are currently out with the authors. We're waiting for information to come back in, and 6 of them are currently in process at the Odum Institute. Of the 68 papers that have gone through the process completely, only 6 of those were successfully reproduced on the first attempt. Virtually everything else, the remaining 62, what we've had to do is send the materials back to the author and say, something didn't work here. You know, we need to either have you provide more information or correct an error in the code or in the instructions or what have you to get to the point where we can go back and reproduce it. The various manuscripts have been sent back to the author between 1 and up to 4 times. I think on average it's about 1.5 times. So authors usually get it right after 1 or 2 tries. Again, we don't think we have any instances where somebody tried to falsify anything there. These are minor little errors that people have made. The cost of this, I suppose, or the cost to the authors in the publication process is the additional time required for the verification process. The length of time has varied from 14 days to, I believe, 118 days was the longest one. The average amount of time for the verification process is just over a month at about 35 days. A lot of this time is taken up not by the Odum Institute, but in us waiting for responses from the authors. So in the end, I have to say, again, we've only got 13 months of experience with it so far, but I believe we have a wildly successful policy here. If nothing else, we've caught these minor errors that authors have made, but even more than that, I think we're making an important contribution to the infrastructure of social science here. We are guaranteeing that if a paper is published in the AJPS, it is reproducible, that it is possible for people to go back and do it. Does it solve all the problems? Of course it doesn't solve all the problems, but at least it introduces a note of transparency that was not available before, and a set of regular procedures that effectively takes it out of an author's discretion and says to people, if you want to publish in the American Journal of Political Science, which I'm happy to say lots of political scientists do, you're going to have to comply with these procedures there. I'll end by saying I have personally had very little pushback on this. Now, I hear rumors that there are big segments of the discipline that are unhappy about this, but these people are not saying it to me directly. So I'm actually very happy about yeah, exactly. Apparently, though, they're not hesitant to say it directly to other journal editors. Chris and I were on a panel 2 weeks ago where the head editor of the American Political Science Review was on, and he made very clear that people are not hesitating to tell him that they don't like things, and they haven't even implemented the policy yet. So I'll stop there and pass it along with that.
Okay, next I want to turn to Samin to talk about your experience with your journal and so forth.
So the journal Social, Psychological, and Personality Science is a short report format journal for social and personality research. And so manuscripts are limited to 5,000 words. And the structure of the journal is such that I'm the editor-in-chief, and I can recommend policy changes, but I can't make policy changes myself. So there's a board of representatives from the 4 associations that own the journal, and they make policy. So if I want something to change in the policy, I have to go to the board. The board talks to the executive committees of their 4 organizations, and then they take a vote. So I've been editor since last July, and there's a number of policy changes that we've made since then, and a number that I've wanted to make but haven't been able to. So some of them are more explicit policies, like we now are in the process of trying to implement the open data badge. So this is just for those articles that where the data are publicly available, we will put a badge on them. PsychScience has been doing this. The publisher has said that they're not able to do this yet, but they will soon have the capability, so we'll start doing it once they are able to. We now have a process during submission. The authors have to check 3 boxes indicating that they disclosed in the manuscript how they determine their sample size and discuss statistical power. Another box that says that they disclose any data exclusions, so any outliers that were dropped, any conditions or measures that were dropped, and that they disclose any relevant analyses that they may have run that weren't included in the final manuscript. So they're supposed to check those 3 boxes saying they disclose those things. We now identify the handling editor when a manuscript is published. The name of the handling editor is published with the manuscript, so we're trying to increase transparency on our end as well. And we now encourage authors to submit replication studies. This was not explicitly not allowed before, but it wasn't mentioned as a type of manuscript that we consider, and now we explicitly state that we do. Some less formal policies, but things that I stated in my editorial, was that we're going to focus a lot more on statistical power. And so I ask authors to justify their sample size, and I also talked about some of the problems with common justifications that authors give for sample size, so assuming a very large effect size based on studies in the past that were very underpowered and subject to publication bias and so on. So I said explicitly in my editorial that it's not enough to give some justification for your sample size. You need to give a good justification, and that justification will be subject to review. And we might say, sorry, no, that's underpowered despite your power analysis. There's a little bit less emphasis on novelty. So especially short report journals often emphasize novelty a lot. In my editorial, I mentioned that we're open to incremental research. Not everything has to be groundbreaking and novel. I'm not very sympathetic to the argument we already knew this. I think that we really don't know very much, so I'm perfectly happy to consider manuscripts that show something that we think we already know. I also mentioned encouraging null results. We're open to publishing null results when the evidence is strong. We made some other minor changes. Some changes we haven't made that I would have liked to see. We did not sign the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines that I helped contribute to. We don't have registered reports. I would have loved to include that as a type of manuscript submission, but that does require a lot of changes in the review process. So that's what some of the speakers earlier today talked about, where you have peer review of the proposal, the study design. We don't have that. And I would like to do something a little more than providing badges for open data. I would love for open data to be the default and to ask authors to state whether their data are publicly available, and if not, why not. My proposal to the board was to ask authors to say that, and that we would accept any reason. So because it's too hard would be an okay reason for now. So let's start there. Let's start by asking authors to state in their manuscript why their data are or aren't publicly available, but that is already too far, I think, for in the field of social and personality psychology. Even just providing a badge for those who do share their data is already kind of on the cutting edge of what journals are doing. So that's something that hasn't happened yet, but maybe we'll move towards that. In terms of pushback, I also haven't had any pushback directly expressed to me. Actually, there were some where I was copied on the email, but I'm not sure if the person writing the email knew that I was copied on it. So I've seen the policies described as draconian by a few people. Someone called them an albatross. So those are the words I've heard the most. But I haven't heard, the people I've heard saying that are not necessarily the people who are experiencing the effects of these changes. It's the authors whose papers I just reject because of low power, things like that. So often if I just reject a paper because of low power or signs of flexibility in data analysis, not strong evidence, I often say, if you can conduct a replication of this, especially if it's pre-registered, but even if it's not, if it's a fairly direct replication, I'll consider your manuscript. And many of them write back and say, yeah, we were considering doing that, we think that's a good idea. And of course, they're sugarcoating their response for me. I'm sure they're thinking much less nice things, but the response has been relatively open to, yeah, okay, we thought this might happen. So I'm pretty happy with the reaction that we've had so far. The other journal that I'm associated with, Collabra, is the open access journal that UC Press publishes. It's a brand new journal. We haven't had a lot of submissions, so I don't have a lot to say about it yet, but I'm really excited about it. It's kind of a mega journal, but kind of not. We are trying to have more specialization within the mega journal, so there's a social sciences branch, and within that, there's editors with different areas of expertise, and we're hoping to specialize even more so that we have the required expertise for a lot of different topics. So we're excited about that. Look for it. The author publication charges are pretty small, and there's waivers available for people who don't have the resources.
Thank you. Next, John Patty.
Well, thanks. I want to thank everybody for the organizers for having me. So I co-edit a journal that is mostly, almost entirely focused on formal mathematical models. And we have signed on to the, my co-editors, Torin Doohan at the London School of Economics, and we signed on to this, this DART statement, which is, I think, essentially political science specific, which is a number of journals, which I know that both Bill and Chris have also signed it, pledging to essentially lay out for the authors what the transparency expectations are for the journal. Okay, so in a sense, this is a statement that really binds editors more than binding submitters. Our experience, ironically, has been, we don't have a real issue with this in our journal, but our experience so far has been that the blowback, the blowback has been that we are actually taking an epistemological stance with this policy adoption. So for those of you who aren't in political science has a very vibrant and active use of qualitative data. And the interpretation of replicability and transparency in our field has been loaded with basically, is this privileging quantitative data? And we may or may not talk about that in a few minutes. But that is unfortunate that this discussion sort of melds into that because of the fact that essentially I think that the reason that we signed on, what we really want, Torin and I want at our journal is that people are thinking ahead of time, what are your reasons for what you're about to do? So laying out, in a sense, ex ante. It's like registration, but while you're writing the paper, put in the published version, I made this choice because of X, Y, or Z. And I think, again, as some of the earlier presentations, especially with regard to registration, sort of alluded to, I think it really saves the authors a lot of hassle down the road. Precisely because, thinking more generally than just p-hacking, the idea of when you are criticized in another venue, right, or in a subsequent article, when you are criticized for a decision you made, right, the question is, can you offer an actual justification that's not ex post? So just thinking more generally than just data or fraud, but actually as a modeler, when you decided to make this decision, we want to remind ourselves as editors as well as remind the reviewers and the authors that this should be in the text, that this particular, if it's contentious, don't hide that, just say it's contentious and I had to choose something. And so we've gotten very little blowback personally from that. Again, we don't have many submissions with data, and I think that data is seen as the onerous part right now. In terms of alluding to where I see the real problems coming up and Bill sort of touched on this with regard to the AJPS's policy, I think Chris will as well, is that there's a real upfront burden on, regardless of what your methodology is, in terms of managing how much material you're going to accept for the manuscript. So for the types of things that we do, typically these are mathematical proofs, and there are some on the very hardcore sort of right wing, if you will, of this transparency. They want every claim proven in full detail, which is arguably inefficient in some cases. But the real problem is that that's incentivizing authors to provide us with 80-page appendices, right, up front. And so then the question is that peer reviewed? And I'm just going to go ahead and lay it out. It's not. I'm a reviewer. I'm an editor. And the reviewers will tell me that they looked through that. But in a sense, I hope they didn't. And so I think that that's the real challenge that we're facing now, is sort of the question of prioritizing the questions that the author may subsequently face versus the ones that are unlikely to, that the stakes are low. And so I don't know, we'll have another conference in 5 years and we'll figure out how that played out.
Chris Kantak?
Yeah, so I want to sort of speak briefly about how the journal that I co-edit with Chris Bono, State Politics and Policy Quarterly, handles our replication policy, and then talk mostly about process in terms of how we got to the place where we have the policy that we do. And the reason that I don't want to talk very much about how we do things at SPPQ is because you've already heard it. We pretty much word for word, with attribution and permission, stole Bill's policy. It's up there on our website, and it says, thanks to Bill Jacoby for this. And so I think that's something really important as we're thinking about issues for our disciplines in general. It's incredibly important to have a first mover, to have someone in the discipline who's saying, this is how I'm going to do it. Right, and maybe it's not perfect, but this is how I'm going to do it. And then so little guys like us can come back and say, all right, well, that's how we're going to start too. And then it might turn out that ours will work out a little bit differently as we kind of work through the kinks. But our policy works exactly the way Bill's does. We use the Odum Institute in the same way. We just began it in January. We've just had a handful of manuscripts go through the process. We've yet to have a manuscript that came through the replication process clean the first time. Every single one of them has gone back to the authors. Again, that's just a handful of manuscripts. In terms of the process, when my co-editor Chris and I took over the journal, this was something that we had kind of had we had in mind about working on sort of improving the policy from the policy of previous editors that had been really quite good too. And so this was something that was important to us. And one of the big things that comes out of this, my journal is attached to the state politics group within the American Political Science Association. So we have dues-paying members. And so one of the big issues involved with that is that having the Odum Institute do this checking isn't free. It's not that expensive, but it's not free, and somebody has to write the check. And so our organization had to be willing to, the membership had to be willing to put up the money to do that. Now, in terms of the conversations that we had both with our editorial board and with the membership of our organization, when we were talking about a transparency policy, had a lot to do with a lot of the issues that John had referred to. Well, what does this mean for qualitative data? Is this, how are we supposed to, if we're giving you qualitative data, how are we supposed to meet your criteria? And what ended up happening, what ended up coming out of that was actually a really interesting conversation about how we all do research. And there are a lot of flavors of qualitative research in political science, but for the flavor that you see most of within our organization that studies state politics, it's really very similar, right? So for a qualitative scholar to say to me as the editor of the organization's journal, well, I can't tell you who the people are that I've interviewed because I've promised them anonymity. Right? My response to that is, look, I every time I go into the lab, I have to promise anonymity to my subjects, right? I've been through this with the IRB. It's no different. It's not at all problematic to me that you can't tell me the name and address of the person that you talk to. But there is information that we want to have so that we can see maybe not necessarily reproducibility in the same way, but a different kind of reproducibility. So if you can tell me who you talked to in this venue, if you can give me as much information as you can, given the promises that you've made, then when I decide to do qualitative work in a slightly different venue, I can talk to a similar person and see if we come to similar conclusions. Now, that's not what a lot of us in this room are talking about when we're talking about reproducibility, but it's a level of transparency that allows us to know as much as we possibly can about where our data is coming from. So for me, really the bottom line is I want to know what you're doing. I want to know how you got your data. And I think there are two things about that, and I think this became clear from some of our sessions earlier. We don't talk very much about how we do research, and we almost never talk about our failures, and that's a real problem when it comes to training graduate students to be social scientists, because we pretend like our papers just, flew from our heads one day, fully formed and ready to be published in the top journals of our discipline, but that's not how it works. Right? And so one of the things that comes out of transparency is that people can see that this is hard, right? That there's a lot of effort that goes into this. And so when you see a final product that is an excellent paper that you really esteem and you would like to, as a young scholar, do that kind of work, you can see where that came from. And that's incredibly valuable. The other issue I think that has come out of this kind of discussion of data transparency issues in political science as an editor are concerns, and I think really real concerns, about how this is a moving target. And we have, as an editor, I have some real thoughts about normatively where I would like the discipline to go in terms of transparency and reproducibility. But there's another thing going on here, which is that people need to publish in our journals in order to keep their jobs, right, or get a job. And so there are very real concerns from graduate students that, well, what if tomorrow all of the journals decide that they're not going to publish anything that doesn't have pre-clearance? And if I started my dissertation and I'd never heard of pre-clearance, does that mean I don't get to be a social scientist? Now, the answer to that question is, hell no, that's stupid. We're not going to do that. But, those of you who are in graduate school know this, and those of you who remember it, I think know it too. It's still really nerve-wracking, right? It's still really scary. So we're making these changes and trying to turn our disciplines into what we really want them to be. But I think at the same time, it's really important to keep in mind that that there are people who are trying to build careers here, that our discussions make them really nervous, and not because they want to break the rules or they want to cheat, but because they're afraid that somebody somewhere is going to make a decision that's going to cut them out of the ability to get a job or get tenure.
Well, thanks a lot. I have a number of questions that I've come up with, and I'm going to just start the conversation with a few of them. What I would encourage the audience to do, if there's follow-ups to these questions, or if they want to contribute to the conversation, just raise your hand, and we can take the microphone to you. So I'll just go ahead and start out. So about a year ago, in psychology, I can't remember the name of the journal, but the journal forbade the use of p-values. Basic and applied social psych, okay. And that was a fairly controversial policy change. And recently, the American Statistical Association just released its statement on, on p-values and probability values, and I thought that was a pretty interesting read. Which leads me to this question here. And this question sort of came out of discussion with a bunch of grad students I had the other day. What should we be reporting when it comes to quantitative results? The prevalence of p-hacking implies the focus on, 0.05 or lower, and we saw in Garrett's presentation just that the density at the 0.05 level, and also in Cristobal's talk, similar things. So I guess I would just turn it over to you as journal editors. What should we be reporting? Effect sizes, p-values, credible intervals, and what should we be telling our grad students?
If I had my druthers, I'd like to see the credible intervals. I think that's probably the most effective way to present the information. And when I came in as editor at the American Journal of Political Science, one of the things I wanted to stop was the proliferation of asterisks and tables there. It's impossible. At least in political science, I can't do that. It's too ingrained a habit. The R function that creates the table from your LM function output automatically puts the asterisks in there. I guess I've been guilty of I've been accused, at least, of using probability levels blindly, because we have a requirement that if you're going to report a probability level, statistical significance doesn't start till the 0.05 level. I think some nefarious reasons have been read into that. All I'm trying to do there is to prevent people from sneaking in what I consider non-significant results that are significant at the 0.1 level in a one-sided test as something that's there when it's not there. At least I don't think it's there. It's do I believe that the 0.05 level is critical or important? The one we should be using? Not really, but it's a standard. It's one standard that we just use and request people that report that. So.
We also require effect sizes and confidence intervals for key findings at SPPS, and we also now require exact p-values instead of just p less than 0.05. And both of those are an attempt to move away from binary thinking and to think more in a continuous fashion about the strength of the evidence. And Cohen famously said, surely God loves the 0.06 as much as the 0.05. But I think we also need to remember that God doesn't love the 0.05 very much. So I think one thing that happens when people talk about moving away from this binary thinking of 0.05, and this is, I think, what happened at BASP, is then people start saying, oh, good, now I can publish my 0.06, 0.07, 0.08 result. I'm trying to move things in the other direction, saying move away from binary thinking, which means when you see a 0.04 result, that's kind of weak evidence. That's not very strong evidence at all. So part of moving away from binary thinking is not just tolerating weaker results that aren't quite significant but might suggest a trend, but also recognizing that those on both sides of 0.05, those not very compelling results, mean that you should calibrate your conclusion and maybe go out and collect more data before you draw any conclusions. So I think anything that encourages moving away from binary thinking is good. That doesn't mean lowering the standards, which I think can sometimes happen when you take away the cutoff. I think, if anything, we should have higher standards.
I think that one of the, as a reviewer and editorial board member at broader journals, I think one thing, at least in political science and economics, that is important is not only not to focus on statistical significance, but also to actually ask the prior question of, was there any reasonable expectation that the test could have come the other way, alluding to the one-sided test trickery. And in terms of what I work on and mostly review is essentially a qualitative nature. It models structural representations of processes, and so I think the right way for us to push, and also for younger people to write their papers, is to really think about talking to the reader, in a sense, and the reviewers about why this is an interesting question from the standpoint of, like, this hypothesis is the right one to focus on, because the other 8 that I could test here, there's no reason to suspect that the coefficient could have been negative. And in particular in political science and economics, there's a lot of cases where I think we end up doing something related to p-hacking. It's sort of what I call a hypothesis, bloat. They're like, I've got 1 million, control variables, and I'm going to go and I've got all these hypotheses. Like, for example, people will work harder if they're paid more. I've confirmed that in the data, and I think that that's actually something that we need to clean it up a bit, because that's essentially what leaves a paper with a whole bunch of tendrils that were very low stakes. No one actually cared about it, but it's a place where fraud or sloppiness can emerge. And again, from the young scholar perspective, which I think Chris is right to bring that up, as an editor, I try to urge the men and women who submit these things to keep it small and focused on the things that are important.
I think it also, this question of obsession with stars is related to a bigger notion of how we train people to do social science and how we think about social science. So one of the things that always kind of gets under my skin is when I hear, it's particularly graduate students, but I also hear faculty say it, well, so here are my results, and my results prove that I'm right. And we don't, Patty proves things, right? I don't prove things, right? So every now and again. And I think that's really important, right? We have a belief about how the world works, right? And that's our theory. And we want to see what the evidence is. And so we're trying to build evidence. And a star behind a number is a piece of evidence, right? It's not a particularly interesting piece of evidence, right? There are lots of other pieces of evidence that are more interesting. And so I think when it gets to what's the advice for graduate students, the advice is to put the star in there, because there are some people who really like the stars and really get convinced by the stars. But there are other people who, in my mind, are more right, who want to see other things from your data, right? So what does it substantively tell me? How many, can you specify the model in different ways and your main result stays the same? Or how robust is it to other ways of thinking about the world? So the star is a part, and there are people who walk among us who live and die by the star. So keep the stars in, but understand that you're amassing evidence about whether or not this idea you have about how the world works is true. We're not proving anything. We're trying to tell stories, and we're trying to gather evidence that this story makes sense. And if you think about it that way, then you feel less kind of silly putting the stars in there, because it is something. But you understand where its place is.
So I have a question about the review process. So I think a lot of us younger scholars in social science have been increasingly socialized into this transparency world. And so the instinct, especially if you spend time around stats people or CS people, the instinct is you post your code immediately, you can get people to comment on it, the collaboration is in real time. But then, so I've had this debate with a few of my co-authors about, well, what does this mean for blind review, and whether the reviewers of our paper can search for what we're doing and see our names attached to the code that generated the data. And then as a reviewer, I've often felt like I want to see that stuff because there's a specific question about a manuscript that I have that I could see very easily by looking at the coding, and I lean towards rejecting a paper because I can't answer that question. So it sort of seems like as a reviewer, I also don't have enough. I'm not getting enough material, particularly for empirical papers. And I just want to know what you guys thought about that one.
Well, so I think a lot of this is a moving target, right? I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years when you submit a manuscript, you submit your code and your data with it. We're not there yet. And this is something that, I mean, we've had a number of conversations about how to sort of deal with this kind of issue. I mean, I think at this point it's a little bit piecemeal. I think we all kind of know that in a lot of cases, and probably most cases in political science, double blind is kind of not really double blind. But I mean, but I think it's a nice fiction to hang on to. So I actually wouldn't recommend getting rid of double blind. But yeah, I mean, I think that I have not had a reviewer do this, but if a reviewer sent me an email saying I'd like to see the code, I would probably ask the author for the code.
Let me jump in on that, because we've had this happen. And the HAPS does not provide code. We had several instances of that where reviewers asked for code, and we went ahead and supplied it. And so I went to the editorial board at our next meeting and said, what do you think of this? Should we require the replication materials upon submission? Uniformly, the editorial board came back and said, absolutely, positively not. What people are concerned about, and I think it's a perfectly legitimate concern, is data theft. The American Journal of Political Science has a 93% rejection rate. So almost everything that's submitted to us is not going to get published. So your work doesn't get published, and you've just given your data away to somebody there. So I do not see any change in that direction, at least at the American Journal of Political Science in the foreseeable future. In terms of the double-blind procedure, I think the authors who are concerned about this sometimes are being a little bit disingenuous about this. It's very easy to maintain much of the double-blind nature of it by simply changing the title of your paper from the title that you used when you presented it at a conference, or not posting the material online with your name, with the title of the paper. So I think there are a lot of signaling games that go on that nod, nod, wink, wink. Yeah, this is anonymous, but I want you to know who I am, and I want you to be able to find out who I am here. So there are, a number of times authors and reviewers have come to me and said, oh, I know who reviewed my paper. I know whose paper I'm reviewing here. In all but a tiny handful of situations, they're wrong when they say that. So I think the double-blind review process is a lot healthier than most people really think it is. And if people were honest about what they were doing, I think we could make it even healthier still.
For journals that don't require data posting, they nevertheless clarify the expectation that authors are expected to share their data with colleagues who request them. And for journals that do require data posting, that policy probably existed before, but compliance with it is spotty at best. Is there any way for journals to enforce that expectation? Could you provide retrospective badges for those who do actually share data when requested by colleagues?
I'm not sure, but I do think there should be a consequence. And I was just talking about this earlier with Rich. I think that journals should be at least allowed, and I would think, this is my personal opinion, to say when an author of a paper refused to share data when they had previously agreed that in principle they would share it under those conditions. Maybe that should be marked on the paper somewhere. There should be a list of non-compliant authors, or they should be banned from submitting for a certain period of time, or there should be a consequence, but I don't know exactly what it should be.
They have anonymous links specifically for peer review, so when your projects are not public, you can create an anonymous link and send it out for review, and anyone can look at your code when you send it in. So it's a really nice feature that I meant to mention earlier.
So if you want to share materials like code during peer review, you can provide an OSF link and it won't show your identity, so you can still be blind.
Looks like I'm only going to say one question.
So it does seem sometimes like journals are awfully biased against null results. And so I'm curious what you guys think of a process by which someone might be able to submit a research design and what the question would be, how they're going to do it, and then get conditionally, have the article, or quote unquote article conditionally accepted, or the project conditionally accepted before the results actually come out. I mean, I know some people have thrown that idea around to prevent null findings bias. I'm just sort of curious what you do think of that idea, like what the drawbacks and benefits of it might be.
I think there are enormous practical problems there. With a system like that, each paper that gets reviewed has to be reviewed twice by each referee. And as any editor will tell you, getting people to review the papers is the most difficult aspect of an editor's job. So there are problems with that. There are problems with the inevitable variability that occurs when a person actually goes out and does the research, when things don't turn out the way they anticipated, and if they don't do something to fix the way it didn't turn out, they get criticized for that. If they do make a change, well, then you violated the pre-registration plan. So while in principle I think it's a really wonderful idea, as a journal editor I shudder in horror at the various practical issues that are going to arise when we try to implement this.
So I think there are, I had mentioned before, there are a lot of big benefits of a big journal like AJPS going first on something. There are also benefits, though, for small journals to go first. And I think that this is one of the places where there are. I think that Bill's concerns are absolutely incredibly well-founded, and I think the way we find out how to do it is to give it a shot and see what happens. And SPPQ is actually planning on doing that. We're in the process now of figuring out exactly what that kind of pre-clearance would look like. We're an easy case because we have a very dedicated group of members of the state politics group within the APSA. And so we rely on them a lot to do lots of crazy things. And so this would be just one other kind of weird thing that we're doing, that we're throwing at them. I mean, I think there are a lot of benefits, and I think that that one of the big benefits, getting back to this question of younger scholars, is that it encourages younger scholars to engage in research questions that are a little bit more risky, right? Because if you can get pre-acceptance, then you can go out and collect those data that are going to take a really, really long time to find, and you don't know for sure if you're going to be able to get the p-values where they have to be. So we're trying it, and I don't know. It's a slow process. We're in the process now of trying to figure out exactly how it's going to work. We're trying to get Sage to give us some pages to do it. Sage runs the journal for us, because one of the things we don't want to do is push out other younger scholars' work so that we can have our weird experiment that might totally flop. So I don't know. We're working through it, and hopefully we'll be able to find some stuff out that we can inform some of the bigger guys on what works and what doesn't.
One thing I want to add is that I'm not sure that null results should be held to a higher standard than significant results. So pre-registration is great. I think it would be great for more journals to experiment with that format, but I don't think that's necessary to publish a null result. I think with either null or significant results, we need to worry about the possibility that the result is due to some design flaw. So you need to put in, positive and negative controls, as Michael talked about. With null results, I think you need more power to have more precision so you can rule out meaningful effects. But other than that, I'm not sure what's special about null results other than that we don't like them. But I don't think there's any reason to be that much more skeptical of null results than significant results. In both cases, you want to show that the data had good psychometric properties and that there weren't any confounds and so on. If you can do that, we should want to publish null results that are convincing as much as significant results.
Yeah, I think that from the standpoint of how do we get to a place where null results can be published a little bit better, I mean, I think I agree with Bill about the problems with pre-registration, and this is a problem with how we provide incentives for replications as well, which the Journal of Politics right now is trying a new shorter article format, and this is part of the justification for it, apparently, according to our discussion at the editorial board meeting, was to incentivize replications, which is in a sense kind of the same problem, right? So the problem with a null result is that people are like, well, that's easy to get, and I think people also judge replications as like, well, you didn't have to think as much, like so they did a hard work, and we all know that that's not fair, but there is a heart to that criticism, which I think as editors we need to keep in mind, which is that and I think the four of us in a sense are all saying this in different ways, we don't want to have articles with tags on them to the degree that we can avoid that, right? So you don't want to have like the short article section, and then here's the pre-registration section, and here's the replication section, because ultimately there's always going to be that final section, which is like, that's the way we used to do it, right? And that will be the only valuable one, right? That's the Picasso section, and I think that's, in line with thinking about junior scholars and graduate students. I mean, I think we need to think carefully about providing differential incentives that are sensitive to the costs and realities of different disciplines and different questions, but while also trying to figure out how do we consider all publications in a sense, at least within the same journal, the same. And maybe we don't in the end as a group. Maybe different disciplines want to say actually there is a sort of a clinical track in our discipline. But at least in political science and economics right now, the idea is that a tenure track professor is a tenure track professor, and that's hard to do if we start offering a huge menu of different kinds of publications.
So related to what you all were just saying, and hearkening back to Samin's statement about getting away from binary thinking, I want to point out that all this talk of p-values is predicated on null hypothesis significance testing, which is itself distinctly binary, right? We're saying that there is either a zero effect or there's not. And so Andrew Gelman talks a lot about how in the world in which we operate, in the social world, everything's related to some extent, right? If you put enough people in a power pose, eventually you'll see that they behave differently after that. We can collect a ton of data and get a p-value of less than 0.05 for very, very small effects. So I'm wondering how we might get away from that kind of binary thinking.
I think the focus on effect sizes and confidence intervals helps a lot with that. So considering, is it a practically meaningful effect? I will say in social and personality psych, that's a problem I would love to have. We don't have the problem of things being so overpowered that people are reporting trivial but significant effects. So that happens once in a blue moon. But if we get to the point where we have that problem, I'll be happy to deal with it. I think effect sizes and confidence intervals will help a lot with that. But you do see it, you see it with like, well, I'll stop there.
One of the things I've noticed at the AJPS is over the last couple of years, more and more referees are referring to effect sizes. You know, yeah, this is significant, but what about the effect size here? So I think this is something it's going to take a while to catch hold, but it is coming. So I'm not too worried about that.
Yeah, I think it is, and I don't mean this to be ironic. It isn't a binary question really itself, right? In that, well, when are we going to stop requiring these binary things? Like, we're going to kind of care less and less as the world continues. And I think Bill's exactly right. I'm seeing a lot more of that, both from manuscripts themselves talking about effect sizes and what's important and what's not, and from reviewers bringing up that kind of stuff. So yeah, sure, you have a star behind it, but it doesn't tell me anything really interesting about the world. And this does get to be a problem, as those of us who are in political science know, because a lot of times we have these just really massive data sets.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I've never really thought until today about the binary term here, but I definitely, as a formal theorist, as a person who builds models, I don't actually build anything, I write them down, I draw pictures, and sometimes it makes sense. But in a sense, I'm sort of living that continuum kind of world, like to what degree does the model actually elucidate a causal story that's kind of interesting, or elucidate why you'll never find the causal story, sort of conspiracy theory style models. But I think that the right way to combat it, I think, is to write your paper in such a way that you're just not even acknowledging the binary aspect that you don't want to, right? And you have in the spirit of transparency, saying right up front, I was just reading a really nice law review article where they had coded 1,058 different Supreme Court decisions, right? And right up front, the authors, one of them, this guy Eskridge, who's very famous and very successful, and so maybe he can do this, but he said, we're not going to do any hypothesis testing, there's no significance here, because we have the entire population of Supreme Court cases, and we're only speaking to this data set, right? This is not generalizable. That's just owning it right up front, and at least as an editor, I can say that when an author says that, and then if a reviewer comes back and says, I don't like that, on the margin, I'm going to side with the author, because the author is the one who's signing his or her name to it. And as long as this argument makes sense, I mean, sort of, you were raising some points about, justifications earlier, right? If they offer a justification that passes the sniff test, I'm like, well, you're signing your name to it. So I guess that's a way of saying I would charge forward. I think if you say I don't want to do significance testing because of X, Y, and Z in this context, and that was the only problem with your manuscript, I imagine that the editor would come back and sort of say, well, I like it except for this. Can you just give me some stars, which may be in line with what Bill was saying. So that'd be my practical advice.
Okay. Brad's rolling his eyes at me, so there must be 100 questions in the audience. So I'll make it quick. Thank you very much for speaking to young scholars. This is just critically important. And my question regards kind of this original data collection process. So I'm in the middle of a big original, well, it's not even big. It's original data collection, it's observational data, and it's on parliamentary questions, some of which that I can, do web scraping, and some I cannot. And it's this huge effort towards a product that I kind of hope would be near publishable quality soon. But my fear is having to release that data then opens it up for other people to kind of free ride off my work, though I want it to be transparent. I want other people to use the data. So if you could just talk about strategies, do I hold on to that data and kind of work with it in several different ways for research questions that I think it could help answer, and hold back on kind of the publication process, or how do we manage this tension?
I certainly wouldn't recommend holding back on the publication process. Our philosophy about this is that if you publish in the American Journal of Political Science, your work is in the public domain at that point, and you have to provide the evidence that you used to generate the conclusions that you report in there. Therefore, it is absolutely required that you provide the data. Now, we don't want anything more than the data that you used in the article. So the rest of the data that you collect, everything else in your data set, you can retain and hold on to until you publish it. But once it's published, it's out to the scientific community, and they have to have access to it.
I think this is also one of those things that might be scarier in theory than in practice. And I do the same thing. So I just publish the variables I use in a given paper, and then all the other variables I haven't used yet, I don't publish. And that helps a little bit. But I also think nobody's going to notice when you publish your data. And you'd be lucky if people are like, ooh, you know, the data's out. I can't wait to get my hands on it. That's very, very rare. Maybe you have like really amazing data and people are going to find out right away. But I think the odds are no one will notice. And if one or two people do, they'll probably want to collaborate with you anyway. And, you know, I think it's a lot scarier in the abstract than I think it often ends up being in reality.
I also think, just to add one little thing to that, if they're using your data that's out there in the world, they're citing you. And so the response to that is thanks. Because, and that, I think it's something difficult because as early on in your career, just trying to publish, like going back to binary, like a publication is a dichotomous variable, right? But at some point, that's not going to be true. At some point, you're going to want people to be citing your work, and you're going to want your work to be sitting in a literature in a way that makes sense. And the way that happens, one way, is for people to use your data. So that's an awesome thing. If you get a publication and somebody uses your data, that is fabulous.
Yeah, I think I'd just add on to Samin's point in particular. It's real easy for us to all worry about being scooped or so forth, but turns out as you get older, you realize that you're actually one of two people in the entire world interested in that topic, and the other one's like, I don't know. But in all seriousness, I think that it's pretty rare, you know, and I think this is important for the transparency and replicability and reproducibility debate in general. It's important to keep in mind what the stakes are. And in terms of career advice, at least in political science and economics, I can speak, you know, pretty authoritatively to this. You know, you definitely don't get denied tenure for having too many publications, right? So I always tell people, like, one thing that's true, right, is that an idea you don't send out, right, is not going to get published. And if it does, then you get an endowed chair, you know, because you have magical powers. So you need to send your things out. And piggybacking a bit on Chris's comment, but taking it a different direction, you need to be in the conversation early in your career. And your data now is, you know, it will have been costly, but one thing it won't do for you unless you share it, is actually increase your impact, I think. Because the data, not only is it just being cited, as Chris points out, I think a lot of it is that you will affect those that are interested in your questions by your measurement strategies, right? And so in political science, our closest analog to this, I think, is these guys, Howard Rosenthal and Keith Poole, they went and collected every roll call vote the Congress had ever taken. And this was back in the early 80s. And they just put it up and made it free to everybody. And partly that was because the National Science Foundation asked them to do so, and they, unlike many other people, followed it. But they're hugely important. They have changed that field, the field of understanding parties in Congress, precisely because they put the data up there. Okay, and so I think if you want to think about down the game tree a bit, if you're going for the grand slam, you got to put all the chips on the table, right? I think that if you, to the degree you limit your provision of your own originally collected data, I mean, that's your intellectual product. You are putting a ceiling, I think, on your own career path.
Just very quickly, one of the things we need to be better about is data citations.
Right.
That's a whole other topic that I don't think we've really talked much about. But.
Sure. Bill, I had a follow-up question for you. So I think it's fantastic, this new replication policy that you guys have. Sociology has not been doing this, and I think the journals are very reluctant. They're very concerned about what's going to happen to their submissions, you know. And so I think, you know, I guess your main competitor in the journal field is APSR. And so how much have you been worried about, well, we're going to start losing our submissions and people are going to start going
Our submissions have been increasing every year. I don't believe we've lost any. We keep track of the subfields that we get submissions from. That's been very steady over time, so it really hasn't changed. So I'm not terribly worried about it.
Fred, now APSR is like, well, we don't want to be the unscientific.
Well, that's interesting. The APSR feels that it needs to be more responsive to all areas of the political science discipline. And while I mentioned that people haven't come to me directly, there have been several organized attempts within the discipline to push back against data access and research transparency. And I think it's fair to say that the APSR has been much more responsive to them and willing to hold off than they are. So I think that's one of the things at the Midwest. I can just say I've created this policy. This is it. You know, nobody can call me on that. It's also relatively expensive. So we talked about this a little bit, that in my case, the Midwest is the state politics section supporting the verification procedures. So it's going to have to be the larger organization sponsoring the journals that do this. So I certainly hope it disseminates further. I hope it becomes much more widely used, but I got a feeling that a number of the smaller journals will never be able to do the comprehensive verification things that we do here. But even just making the replication files available, I think is a very, very useful thing, and organizations like the Dataverse make that very easy to do.
I will say, I think societies and journals worry a lot about the possibility that making these changes will reduce their impact factor or their submission rates. I don't hear them worrying about the possibility that not making these changes will reduce their impact factor and submission rates, and they should be worrying about that, I think.
So I'm going to probably raise something related to this in the last session, but in terms of data release and data sharing in biology at least, and in some areas of biology, there's been a big risk associated with asking people to ask others for access to the data rather than requiring them to post the data. There's been a lot of bullying and other types of activities where if the data is not publicly released in some manner and you say, oh, you just have to ask the author for access to the data, there's been a huge amount of untoward activity associated with getting access to that data, putting names on papers without doing anything and such. So I think it's, if we are going to encourage release of data, it should be in a public format rather than requiring private contact.
I think that's a great point, and I actually think that it highlights another issue which we may or may not have in the next 20 minutes or whatever time to reach, which is what is the right role for the journal as regarding being an arbiter of truth as the journal, right? Is the journal a forum in which things are published and that's it, and then later on reproducibility sort of over time speaks to the truth of that original article, and to what degree does the journal itself take on ownership in the sense of data or in the sense of the code? I mean, it just as I like to be a contrarian every now and then, but at my journal right now, we would never, ever claim to reproduce anything that the authors have provided. We would be completely in favor of transparency. And so I think we all of us are on the same page there. But I actually worry sometimes about the argument that that a journal has actually reproduced the results, because the degree, I mean, again, I think that both Bill and Chris are doing it the right way, outsourcing it to the Odum Institute. But you can't, right? As we've seen with some recent scandals, right? They could have handed you fake data. And so that inherent uncertainty about what went on in the research process, I think that journals, we have to think hard about, as disciplines, about what we want our journals to actually be seen as warranting versus what we acknowledge that's still the person who signed the article's responsibility.
I will also add, I think this is another case where journals are being completely one-sided about the cost-benefit analysis that they're doing. So there's a lot of talk about the cost. If we require open data to be the default, what's going to happen? You know, all the possible costs. But you bring up a really important point about the cost of the old model, which is still the model in psychology, which is if you say, okay, the authors have to make the data available upon request, what position does that put junior scholars in who want to email, you know, the famous professor at Harvard and say, hey, I'm interested in your data, maybe because I'm skeptical of your result? You know, that's a huge cost too, and we should be weighing the costs on both sides. And right now we're really, really focused on the costs of the reforms, and not the cost of the old way of doing things.
Just to add a follow-up to that, I've been in discussions to create something, if people know Retraction Watch, to create something called Open Data Watch, where people can report, I asked the authors for the data and I didn't get the data. And it's a way of sort of needling the system to say, we shouldn't have to do that, right? I mean, it should be a simpler way to get access to the data.
Follow-ups to that?
Sounds good.
Change tack just a little bit here, and maybe not spend too much time dwelling on this, but there are enough, in political science, as John was pointing out, there's a significant strand of research that focuses on, say, qualitative data, more so than, say, quantitative data or statistical analysis. And at least the three political scientists on here, in referencing the transparency policies, did remark that there has been some pushback from that side of research. And given that political science in the social sciences isn't the only one that does this sort of qualitative stuff, I mean, Bill this morning made reference to work in sociology. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more, maybe a couple of you, on what the pushback has been, and if the pushback is warranted by the actual, stated policies. In other words, are people misconstruing the policies? Is qualitative research materially being harmed because of these policies? And I think it's worth discussing because I'm sure there's faculty and grad students in here whose research is in that domain.
John made a great response to one of the pushback efforts earlier, but I think if I can group them under three headings, the primary pushback has been, first of all, authors should have access to their data before everyone else. Second of all, qualitative research is there's a bias against qualitative research. And third, human protection, or subject protection of human safety. My general response to this is these people didn't read our policy. We address those things or are in the midst of addressing them. So we've already talked about the author access, and author access is protected to anything you didn't use to produce your HAPS article. I didn't mention this earlier, but we are currently in the process of a major revision of our replication policy. I'd hoped to actually have it up by now, but it probably won't be for another week or so, that explicitly incorporates qualitative data. One of the principal investigators on the data access and research transparency front in political science is himself a very prominent qualitative researcher, Colin Ellman, and he has helped us revise our replication policy. So we now have a major section about replication standards for qualitative data, and we are going to verify qualitative analyses as well. This will be done not by the Odum Institute, but by the staff at the Qualitative Data Repository at Syracuse University. So we do take that into account as well. There were always exceptions for human subjects protection, and we have now written that in the new version of the replication policy. It'll be written in there as well. So I think, and again, I'm a journal editor and I have my own point of view. If these people had read the policy, we would have had less pushback.
I mean, I do think, I think there are some real concerns because people don't know exactly what the policies in political science mean. I also think there's a little bit of willful misunderstanding of what the policies are. And so there's a lot of, these debates can get very heated and very frustrating because of that. And I think, and I've shared with these guys this view as well, that one of the kinds of pushback we get is, well, this is just journal editors trying to make an end run around qualitative data and cutting qualitative scholars out of the discipline altogether. And my response to that is that journal editors don't need an end run around qualitative data, right? If I don't want to publish qualitative data, I won't publish it, and you won't ever see it, right? I will just desk reject it, and you won't ever see it. Now, the difference with this policy, and this is another level of transparency, is that I now have to, as a journal editor, I have to tell you what my criteria are. Right? And so one of the things that has come out of this is that I have a number of venues have said publicly, SPPQ publishes qualitative work. If you send your qualitative work to us, we will review it and it might get published. One of the issues that happens with this is we don't get very many qualitative submissions. And so we're grappling with this issue as well as trying to rewrite our policies to be more explicit about what we want our qualitative scholars to do, and that is a process that never would have happened had it not been for this push for written policies for journals to provide, right? Because the other way is not, editors have to take everything. The other way is editors can implement whatever policy they want and not even explain to you what the policy is.
Yeah, no, I agree with Chris, although I find it charming, Bill, that you think anybody actually reads our policies at all. It's like
Well, they clearly don't.
unicorns and Bernie's running a journal now. But I think the right way in terms of thinking about what an advantage, right, a sort of hidden.
You know this is being recorded, and he'll be able to watch
Again,
this.
but that's very meta because as I say, I think that we often overestimate how much people go and watch the videos of conferences, right? So like in a sense, like if somebody actually watches my performance at this conference, which I'm having a great time with, it says more about them than about me, right? But I think in all seriousness, I think that people are worried, whether it be qualitative or quantitative. I think younger scholars and in a sense even some of the older scholars, more established scholars in qualitative-ish fields in the social sciences are feeling insecure because they are worried about something that's probably not going to happen. They think that people have free time to just go and take their replication materials and just tear them to shreds. And going back to my statement a few questions ago about the professional incentives, especially for the younger people, my transparency standard as an editor is tell me what you did and then tell me how you did it, right? Or tell me why you're not going to tell me. Okay, and then at that point, the stakes are a little bit higher epistemologically, because I would say, if you're going to tell me you can't tell me how you did it, then I'm going to ask you to not call it a methodology. I'm going to tell you, divine inspiration, we might be able to publish that too. And so I think in terms of qualitative coding strategies and typologies, I think that the professional impact of your work will be maximized by making it clear, by laying it out there. Because again, at the end of the day, as long as you are nice to others, I think in general in most of our disciplines, most other people will be nice back to you, right? And I think that you're just minimizing the impact of your work because people can't, you make it harder for them to play with your topic.
I want to again change tacks a little bit and go back to the issue of data accessibility, which we spend a lot of time talking about, but also connect this to code accessibility. So Bill, in your response to Corey Belden's question, you talked about making data available, and it absolutely needs to be made available upon publication, but you made reference to the data that's actually used in the article. I'm wondering, though, if you could clarify that a little bit, because of course I work a lot with observational data, and so to get to an end, so what we might call an end state data set that I might use for publication, it might entail the use of a whole bunch of primary data sets and a whole bunch of coding decisions and a whole lot of code in the current paper that I'm working on here to produce to produce the destination state data set. So I guess I wonder if you could clarify for all of us who want to submit articles or papers, what it is that we should be planning on submitting at least upon acceptance of the article. Are we talking about the canonical data sets, the canonical code, or are we talking about the end state code and end state data set?
You certainly need the end state data set and the end state code. There's absolutely no question we want to have that there. Ideally, what we would like to have is how you got to the end state data set from the initial data sources. So the gold standard of this would be provide the initial generic data set and then the code that you use to get to the end, which we realize that most authors wouldn't want to and couldn't do. But in a case like this, where you've got data collected and merged together from a variety of different sources, even if you don't provide those original sources, which in many cases you wouldn't, we do want to see the code that you used to get from the original sources to that final. So that, again, if an interested researcher wanted to reproduce those steps, he or she could when the time came. So that's what we request. We're feeling our way through this. We're all new at this, so there's been necessarily some adjustment with particular studies. So, but that's what we would like to do.
So, can I ask you guys about computational reproducibility? This is something that I thought was kind of an abstract concern. People talk about, software versioning, all this stuff, and I was kind of thinking this was not an issue. And then I, downloaded and audited some data from a recent paper from last year, and in the 6 months between their paper and my audit, the linear modeling package changed. Their models no longer give convergent answers. I can't get anything to work. So as the software evolves quickly, how do you think about reproducibility? And do we need to reproduce the full state of the machine at the time that the software is being developed?
That's an unexpected problem with us that we've encountered too recently, where in I think the space of 2 or 3 weeks, we had reproducibility issues with analyses that were carried out in MATLAB and R, and we said, oh yeah, well it's because R is open source, so people can change that, but Stata just as well. So what we have always required, although people have been indifferent in conforming to it, is that you let us know what version of the software, what version of the package, those kinds of things. Up to this point, there's actually a case in process right now where they can't get the results to converge. But usually when the Odum Institute has been able to go to the software with the version that the author provided, they've been able to reproduce it there. But like I said, we have this one now that's not working, and it's a convergence problem, as you said.
Hi, so a little related to your question about this process of having the raw data and the scripts and then that final data product. Could you speak to the idea of data papers? You probably don't have those in your journal, but how would you feel about a paper that has results based on data that was published in a data paper? Would that be acceptable? And similarly, preprints. Do you have any policies?
Not sure what you mean about a data paper. Can you
So there are journals that will just publish a data set. So, you put a lot of work into generating your data set. Rather than waiting until you necessarily have drawn a conclusion from that data, you publish actually that data set. Say, here's my data set, here's what I did, here's how I collected it, here's how I cleaned the data to get to this, the set that now you can use in the rest of your analyses in it. And it makes it so that you don't have to put all of that in your paper, where really what you want to do is test a hypothesis. So that's what I mean by a data paper.
Yeah,
and then preprints is my other question, and what your policy is.
You mean the early view online?
Right, yeah.
Okay, data papers, we've actually had people submit data papers to us, and we can't accept them. Those get desk rejected. It's just not what the AJPS does. I would certainly have no problem in somebody publishing an analysis off a data paper. I don't really see how that would compromise any of the reproducibility or replication policy that we have. Preprints, we want the data and replication files up at the time that the article goes into what Wiley calls early view. So as far as we're concerned, it's published when it appears online. When it gets the DOI assigned to it, that's when it's there, and that's when we require the replication materials to be available.
Preprint server before they submitted it to you, like SSRS or OSF.
Okay. What's...
Or are you not allowed to?
Some of the fields won't publish things that have been made publicly accessible. No, in political science, there's no norm against that. You can't have published it in a peer-reviewed outlet before, but yeah.
Yes, I was just kind of curious, to what extent do big, shocks to either political science or the field of psychology, I think about what happened with the Transparency Project, with psychology, and that really made it out into kind of the mainstream news world, or the LaCour fiasco that happened in political science, which also bled out into the mainstream news world. I'm just kind of curious to what extent those major shocks kind of affect standards about transparency in the system, and how that has affected the way people are talking about it.
I think probably overly. I think there's with the LaCour scandal, for example, that doesn't happen very often, right? And I think it does not make sense to come up with a whole set of draconian policies for cheaters and people without ethical compasses, because they're going to be there, but there's just not that many of them. Right? And so I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to make things tougher for researchers who are trying to get at whatever nugget of truth they can, to have to go through those things. I mean, the LaCour story read one way in the mass public, but to me, and I think to a lot of political scientists, that's a perfect example of how transparency is really important. That is science working the way science is supposed to work, right? We should all, high-five each other over the Liqueur scandal, because somebody cheated and we figured it out. So that's a good thing, right? We had a stress test and we passed. And now it could be that there are lots of other stress tests going on that we're not passing, but that one we passed, and we passed it because of data transparency, because of the fact that that there are these norms that you share your data and you talk about what's going on in your data and how you collected it.
For-profit journals exploit the volunteer labor of researchers, reviewers, editors, slow down and restrict dissemination of our work, claim copyright over it, and then charge our own libraries for access. This antiquated business model's days are numbered. I wonder if you could comment on the switch to open access journals.
There's a reason I have one foot in each world. I would love for things to shift more to open access. And I agree with everything you said. I don't know how we make that shift, but I hear that you're giving a talk in half an hour. Maybe you'll tell us.
Editorial teams should move en masse to open access alternatives to for-profit journals.
I think that's right. I think that the difficulty that so I think I may be the only person who works for a journal that's not owned by an association. So Journal of Theoretical Politics is just owned by SAGE, and so I serve at the pleasure of the Queen or somebody. And she just turned 90, so that's going well. But in all seriousness, I think that there are good arguments for having a broad spectrum of journals, because of the fact that, as we were talking about with the American Political Science Review, association-led journals, which is probably the only way we're really going to successfully transfer to an open access model, right, is sort of collective action on our part. The problem there, at least in political science, and to some degree even in economics, is that those associations are occasionally brought into fights within the discipline, and can they credibly run a journal? The APSR right now, I would argue, has a credible commitment problem, because the APSA is a 10,000 member association that is in the middle of methodological conflict, and the APSA is like, well, we got to make sure we're representative, right? And so can the APSR adopt the same kinds of editorial policies with that problem? I can adopt whatever policies I want to because there is no association, okay? So now I don't know if that's the right model, but I think having a little bit of both is possibly useful in terms of that robustness check. But I completely agree. I mean, it would be nice if we could have the journals charge our libraries a lot less.
Since the question about sort of the journal format came up, this I'm mostly directed to Samin, because you mentioned that your journal is a short format journal. And speaking from the perspective of a political scientist, that's not a common format that we have, and I don't think that that's a common format in sociology or a lot of the other disciplines. So I'm wondering if you could sort of maybe tell us a little bit more about the short form format and how or if that format is maybe more amenable to publishing, shall we say, null results or replication or robustness checks and things like that.
So at SPPS, the word limit is 5,000 words. Another short format journal is Psychological Science. They have various word limits, but the longest is around 5,000 words. One thing we're trying to do, so Psych Science no longer counts method and results sections towards the word limit, which I think is great. I would like SPPS to do that. We took one step in that direction. We don't count tables and figures towards the word limit because we don't want to discourage people from reporting descriptive statistics and so on. I don't know what the rationale is for the short format other than people's attention span, but I actually think that's a good rationale. I think that there's something of value in forcing people to say something succinctly, to have one point to their article and so on. And that's not appropriate for all articles, so I think it's good to have a diversity of formats. But I think the main downside is that it makes it harder to provide all the details you would need for someone to go and replicate your study, for example. But the fact that it's now easy to have limitless space for supplemental materials or for people to put their stuff on OSF and just provide a link. So that helps a lot. So the problem is that that stuff doesn't get reviewed. So I think one challenge for journals is going to be to make it really clear what's reviewed and what's not, and that everything that needs to be reviewed is in the parts that get reviewed. And then if there are word limits, to think about how that affects what's getting reviewed. So if people are forced to put important stuff that should be reviewed in the supplemental materials because of the short report format, that's a big problem that we need to deal with. But to the extent that it allows people to put things that don't need to be reviewed, but that are really, really useful for people who want to do replication, I think it's a great way to separate what does a just casual reader need to see versus what does someone who's interested in replicating the effect need to see. And separating those out, I think, makes the papers a lot more readable and makes the impact of the papers higher.
And a bit of a follow-up maybe for Bill, because I know when you took over HAPS, I think the word count, you've severely cut the word count, which I think is a good thing. Have you noticed any sort of qualitative changes in the kinds of manuscripts that maybe you got when you were at JOP compared to what you are now getting in terms of just the format of the papers? And maybe also comment, and anyone on the panel can do this, on how or if online appendices have maybe improved transparency or reproducibility and such issues.
Yeah, I actually didn't cut the word count by that much, and we changed the way you count what's counted as part of the word count. So we're forcing, of course, authors to be more succinct. I think political scientists, at least, are a lot more verbose than they need to be. So I've seldom had any trouble getting authors to cut parts out. And the authors themselves, when I say, well, my standard acceptance letter has an open-ended sentences, and I want you to cut blank words out. And most of them do it without any difficulty there. I haven't noticed any difference. Again, I think there's a lot of extraneous content. So the ubiquitous paragraph at the end of the introductory section that says, in section 2, I will do this. In section 3, I'll show you the data. In the concluding section, I'll conclude. Get it out of there. You don't need that in there. So I haven't seen any serious difference. Online supplements, wonderful, absolutely perfect. I am always trying to cut down page space because, of course, each page I cut down out of an article is a page I can devote to hopefully including an additional article in the journal. So I ask authors to ship all kinds of descriptive information, the descriptive statistics, robustness tests, these kinds of things into the online appendices. Those are published with the article and will remain there in perpetuity along with the article itself. So I find them extremely, extremely useful.
So if I can jump in for a second, I think there's both Samin and Bill are sort of touching on some important issues that are probably across the disciplines. As we try to make things more succinct and adapt to the online publication, I think we have to start thinking about, and this goes in a sense to the binary distinction, what it is that is being peer reviewed, how do we denote that it is or is not, and to make the point here really clear, one question is the supplemental information, are the proofs or the descriptive statistics or these ancillary pictures, are they looked at by the reviewers or not? That's the first question. But then the next question is, how is that different than the replication materials that we ask them to submit to, which are most definitively not looked at by the reviewers, right? And the reason I bring this up from the standpoint of Don's question, in a sense, like thinking about publishers and the model, apparently at the Journal of Politics, Cambridge University Press publishes them right now, and they basically said, look, everything that you link to on our website from the Journal of Politics, the Cambridge University Press considers it peer-reviewed. Right now, I have no idea when that's ever going to matter. Is that going to be like the craziest legal case ever, right? But it does, go into this point about like if we have a dataverse, should the dataverse be considered as something that it has the journal's stamp on it, or is it actually just something that we're just basically making sure that the server stays up?
University of Chicago.
Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry. To all of those watching the video, I meant the University of Chicago Press, where I work.
Well, we're right at about 3 o'clock, and we have time for one more question. If the audience anyone in the audience has a question? Otherwise, all my questions are pretty boring. We've already covered them all anyway.
Can I just say, I think it's amazing how far we've come. I think if we think back to a few years ago, the idea that we would have major journals in these disciplines doing these kinds of things, I think I would never have thought we'd be here if I predicted it 3 or 4 years ago. So I think that's amazing.
And you're pretty pessimistic generally, so so we're on her pessimism, or her optimism, we'll end the panel. This is really, really useful, I think, and I really appreciate you guys taking part, so thank you very much.